Today, our guest is David Simas. David is the president of the Obama Foundation, based in Chicago, and previously he worked as the deputy chief of staff for the Massachusetts Governor Patrick Deval, and he worked for the Obama administration and as president and the reelection campaign. Just a few tips before we begin today's session. I want to go through a few logistical items. We're on a Zoom webinar, and so the participant audio and video are off. But we're going to reserve time for questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A panel, which is accessible at the bottom of the screen by hovering your arrow over the Q&A button. We're going to go on for about an hour today, and we will try and answer questions for the last 15 or 20 minutes. We'll also have the chat section closed down so that you are paying attention, but we'll open that up at the same time. But we're not going to be paying as much attention to the chat. So if you want to ask a question, be sure to put it in the Q&A part and not in the chat part. We are also recording this conversation, and it will be available on the Garrison Institute website. We offer these sessions free of charge as a contribution to our supporting our community in these times of heightened uncertainty. But we would very much welcome donations of any amount you would like to help us continue to offer these sessions. So thank you again so much, audience, for being with us today. And thank you so much, David, for being with us today. Welcome.
Jonathan, thank you, and thank you to the Garrison Institute, not only for this session, but for all of the work that you and the Institute have been doing for such a long time. And when you had reached out about sharing this time together, especially in a moment like the one that we are in, obviously I'm more than happy to be part of this with you. So Jonathan, thank you.
You're welcome. And this is an extraordinary moment in time, a very complicated moment in time, a demanding moment of time. And it calls for a new kind of leadership. And as our conversations unfolds, we're going to talk a lot about leadership. And it's so, particularly because you and President and Mrs. Obama have done so much thinking about that, it's very, very timely. One of the things you said to me is that first, to be a great leader, you need to have a deep knowing of yourself and then a deep knowing of others. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that.
So one of the things that I learned very early on, and Jonathan, the first time I was in any kind of leadership position, I was in my early 20s. I had just been elected to my local school board in my hometown of Taunton, Massachusetts. And unfortunately, my vision of leadership was in some ways very traditional. It was very top down. It was very, I have this position, I have this title, therefore my idea is ascendant and people should do A, B, C, or D. And Jonathan, I kept on running into wall after wall after wall. And an older member of the school board said to me that I should spend a little bit more time listening actually to what people need, because I might learn a thing or two. It was an invaluable lesson and very similar to what President Obama experienced when he first started organizing on the south side of Chicago. He would go into community hall and church hall, and remember, most of his work was with manufacturing workers,
right,
who had been laid off when the steel industry began to shut down in Chicago. And after a few months of these preliminary meetings, he expressed a tremendous amount of frustration that, what's going on? And his mentor at the time basically advised him to spend the next few months basically just listening to people. And then once you do that, there's this interesting transition that occurs in leadership. You create a space where the first thing that you're doing is you're dealing with the skepticism, the doubt that the other person or people in the room have, right? First thing that will come to a person's mind is, what is your motive? Why are you here? Are you here for quote. Because if you are, there's a transaction to that. You're not from this community. Why do you care about people like me? Do you even understand us? What standing do you have to possibly be here? And so that is a very human reaction that anyone has. And so not only is listening important to actually learn from the community, but it begins to develop a level of basic empathy that then can transition to compassion and trust, where if you are coming back night after night after night, putting in the time, then people begin to see that you aren't there for yourself, but you're actually there for them. And once people then can see and begin to believe that you are there for them, the leadership opportunity begins. But here's the other pivot point. Even at that moment, it isn't about saying, okay, now that we have developed some trust, here's what you need to do, especially in a democracy. What that moment then calls for is less, here's what I think you need to do, but here is the power that you people in this room already have. Here is the voice that you have. You then become, as a leader, actually a conduit, a facilitator for their power, for their voice, for their lived experience. And all you're doing at that moment, Jonathan, is you're taking the lived experience, the shared passion, the shared anxiety, the shared joy. You are basically opening up possibility for people to lead themselves in a way that no one individual, certainly not one coming from the outside, can do. And so whether you describe this as compassionate leadership or servant leadership, or any other kind of variation on that theme, it's something that goes to the heart of my experience, and it's something that at the heart of what we try to do at the Obama Foundation. That's the type of leadership that we try to develop.
And just to underscore, there was the original tradition of Chicago of community organizing came out of Chicago with the Saul Alinsky method, and that was a very different method. So I presume all the people in those community meetings had been Alinsky'd.
I am sure when you think about the South Side, the West Side, and the North Side, because the other wonderful thing about a place like Chicago, and I am new to it. My background is similar in another place with more ethnic lines of division. But Chicago has 77 distinct neighborhoods. And each one of these neighborhoods has a culture to them, has got an ecosystem within them, have got ethnic divisions, racial divisions, class divisions, education divisions, resource divisions. And so building power, building a sense of community where you're bringing disparate groups of people together around a shared vision and then common action, really requires an extraordinary creativity and nuance around those precepts of organizing.
Right.
Now that's true in many places, but you can see why Chicago became and has always been a breeding ground for this type of organizing in a community.
So let's go back to your background a little bit.
Yeah.
So your parents were from Portugal. So tell us about the place your father and your mother grew up.
My father, Antonio Simas, was born in, and I won't do the whole story, but he was born in 1939 in an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's part of the Azores archipelago, part of Portugal. And his island is called São Miguel, St. Michael. And his village is this little village called Faial da Terra, where there are maybe to today 400 to 500 people. And when he was growing up, maybe 1,500 people. Isolated, 9-island archipelago. Each village, like Fayal de Terre, had its Catholic church, had its band hall where entertainment at night were people coming and playing instruments, in its own way of being. And there, as you and I discussed before, Catholicism wasn't just religion, but it was culture. And there in the Azores, especially in St. Michael, when you think about from a Catholic perspective, the Trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I always remember the Azorean community indexing towards the Holy Spirit, o Espírito Santo. And where I grew up in Taunton, Massachusetts, most of the immigrant community was from the Azores. And each one of the Portuguese parishes would have a Festa do Espírito Santo, the Feast of the Holy Ghost. And you would see men and women in procession through the streets of my hometown in Massachusetts, holding this crown that represented the Holy Spirit. And it was always interesting to me why the Holy Spirit versus the other elements of the Trinity. And I just always assumed that in this disparate community of isolated people, that the notion or the vision of the Spirit that infuses everyone in these remote and isolated places was this one moment of unification that would bring everyone together. And so the Azorean Espírito Santo was very, very important. My mother, who is the youngest of 9 and the only girl, her name is David Simas, grew up in a part of Portugal called the Alentejo. And the Alentejo is the region north of the Algarve and a couple of hours south of Lisboa, of Lisbon. Jonathan, it is this dry, arid place where cork trees and these massive farms are essentially the way of life. There, Catholicism was much more, from what I remember, around the Virgin Mary. And at least my perception of it, there was a very matriarchal tendency there, which was different culturally than what I saw. And so this Portuguese immigrant community for me was where I was born and raised. And as the son of immigrants born in the United States, I always found myself desperately wanting to fit in as an American kid. And you'd go to school and you'd play baseball and you would do all of those other things that had the mark of being an American kid. But then at night, come home and the music, the food, the language, the culture, the way of raising a child was deeply traditional in Portuguese. And that tension between the two worlds was actually, for me, the most formative as I've reflected on who I have become, or at least my manifestation right now. I can look back on that tension between wanting to fit in, but that environment that I was being nurtured in, if that makes sense.
Yes, makes a huge amount of sense. And you told me that on Saturday afternoons, as the bridge between those two worlds, you were part of a mass.
So I was an altar boy at St. Anthony's Parish, a Paróquia de Santo Antônio. And I would do Mass on the Saturday afternoon Mass, Saturday evening Mass, and then one of the Masses on Sunday. And Jonathan, the Mass, again, which is one of the fascinating things for me about religion and even religiosity. Yes, there is a deist portion to this, but the cultural and societal element that envelops everything, and the rituals that then transcend that Mass are really powerful. So my first experience with meditation, and I didn't know it, there's this one piece of the Mass where the priest, the Father Medeiros or Father Amaral or some other Portuguese American priest would hold up the host and turn it into the body of Christ. And as you're going through the ceremony, there's a moment where the altar boy has to, at that point it was only boys, ring the bell. And it was very precise when it needed to occur. And it was also very precise about when it needed to stop. And the care that I remember bringing to the act of ringing a bell, and now if I close my eyes and think about the parishioners, mostly Portuguese immigrants, who for an hour a week would have this connection with God in their minds, but at the same time were in community. It was like this wonderful way of the Portuguese immigrant life, where you had left everything behind, and all of a sudden you once again came together in communion, and it was as if you were transported back. And especially when a missa em português, when the Mass would be in Portuguese, you would just see the older men and women. There's this word in Portuguese, it's called saudade, S-A-U-D-A-D-E. And it really doesn't translate very well, but it's this melancholy, it's this longing, it's this deep wistfulness. And there was always this element of saudade, like this longing and a memory that at that moment, people were sharing together. It's so vivid, Jonathan, and just to see how people, that moment of need for communion, to be connected, because you knew that Monday morning, that when the bell in the factories, the whistle, and in my hometown, there are factories everywhere. And so beginning at 6 o'clock and then at 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock, you would hear the whistle and then the procession of people going off to their factory job, where for the next 9 hours or 8.5 hours, they would be doing something called piecework. And you would literally be paid for the number of pieces of whatever you manufactured. And life would begin. But for that hour on a Saturday or Sunday, there was peace in a different way. Thanks for reminding me.
So it's interesting because much of the troubles, we're going to get into more of the troubles later, but in America, it started in the 1980s is when the whistle went away, when the manufacturing disappeared. So I want to take you to another moment of meditation. This is now in 2012, and you're responsible for President Obama's reelection. And everything is coming at you from all kinds of directions, and infinitely people are asking you to make a decision.
My job at the time, Jonathan, on the reelection campaign was I was the director of opinion research. And the responsibility for that person is to work with the team to try to discern opinion as it relates to the binary choice between, in that case, Barack Obama and Governor Mitt Romney. Perceptions of character, perceptions of anxiety, blue versus red, left versus right, anxiety, fear, aspiration, whatever the case may be. I had never done that job before. I had no experience in it. And so I remember sitting in my apartment in Chicago, a new community to me for the first time. And Jonathan, I heard Krista Tippett on National Public Radio. and she was doing an interview with a man that I then had the pleasure of getting to know named John Kabat-Zinn. And it was the first time that I had ever been introduced to meditation. It's the first time that I'd ever been introduced to that type of contemplative practice. And my practice began. The reason I needed it at that moment was what you alluded to. With no baseline of experience, in a position that is going to be central in terms of a reelection campaign for the President of the United States, you can imagine the doubt, the stress, the fear, and then how that begins to manifest itself. And so what I found was carving out and beginning a practice 15 minutes to half an hour every day to just begin to learn how my mind and my body reacted in moments of stress, in beginning to create that space between action and reaction was for me invaluable, not just as a matter of health, but in terms of then doing the job that I was asked to do. I am so grateful to that crazy moment where I just happened to be listening and found an outlet in a way that I hadn't expected. So that's where the journey began for me.
Hmm. And eventually the journey took you to being the head of the president of the Obama Foundation. And the Obama Foundation, we've had a lot of what we've talked about is this interplay between leadership and spirituality and how those two manifest. And also what we haven't talked about, but informs all that is a vision for a better world, a more compassionate and kind world. So the Obama Foundation has developed an ambitious, first of all, fantastic leadership training program and an ambitious set of goals. So tell us about that.
Imagine 100,000 or 1,000,000 Barack Obamas connected to 100,000 or 1,000,000 Michelle Obamas, all throughout the world in the largest network of civic change makers that the planet has ever seen. Right? That when you begin to think about the potential for good and for positive change that flows from that, that's the North Star.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get there, and why is that the approach? When the president thought about what to do in the post-presidency, the way he described it to me and the team was, he said, I care deeply about climate change. I care deeply about racial equality. I care deeply about dealing with income inequality. I care deeply about education and this and that and the other thing. But what I have seen in 8 years as President of the United States is that the way to progress on any of these measures isn't just policy. It isn't just this idea versus that idea. It is leadership, and it's not just elected leadership. So how then do we bring together this universe of people who are all working on these areas that matter and begin to seed a network of civic, not-for-profit, business and political leaders informed by a set of core values: inclusivity, hopefulness, resilience, accountability, and the belief that leadership is about, in its best form, is about having people turn to each other rather than on each other. So what we have been embarking on over the course of the past 3 years, and I think you saw a little bit of what it could look like yesterday, is creating this network of change makers. And then not necessarily telling them what to do, but being there as a guide on their journey to leadership. And when they have a question, connect them to someone else who has lived that experience. When they have a doubt, being there to offer some alternatives. President Obama says he remembers vividly being a young organizer and feeling as if he had to reinvent the wheel, when the reality is there were tens of thousands of men and women like him all throughout the country who were doing that work. Imagine if they were connected. And so that's the vision that informs what we have done. And the one piece that I hopefully we will dig into is, and you alluded to it at the beginning, leadership cannot be about just showing up in a place and in some way having the arrogance of presuming to know that you know what is best and that you have the answer to what a place or a community. And this is where the humility and the spirituality and the understanding of interdependence becomes primary to leadership. It's part of the Obama way. It's the intersection between agency, I have a voice, I have power, and collective action. Yes, you have a voice, you have agency, you have power, but you can never do anything alone.
Right.
That's where the magic happens.
Sharon Salzberg, who's the spiritual advisor of the Garrison Institute, and Ethan Nichtern did a project on politics, and they came up with a distinction that there are basically two political ways to work. And one is what they call the 3 S's, which are politics that tell people they are separate, they are selfish, and they are scared. And it appears to their fear, and it appears to their innate needs in a sense of that there's not enough. And the second kind of politics, so those are the 3 S's, and the others are the 3 C's, are that we are compassionate, we are connected, and we are courageous. Yeah. And so when you describe that sense of power, in some ways what we're really looking for is a sense of not power, but courage. And part of the courage, which is interesting, is not the ego aggrandizing courage, but it's actually the ego melting courage.
Yeah, I love that formulation, and it's so true. The shorthand that I have used is by turning to or turning on. And what Sharon and her colleague, I think, saw is one of the things that I used to do as the political director in the White House is, Jonathan, I would every couple of weeks would listen to people. Like, get out of the bubble in Washington and go listen to people. And I will never forget one focus group during the reelection in 2012 in Iowa. And the first 60 minutes of the group was a discussion around immigration. And after the end of the discussion about immigration, the majority of the undecided participants in the group were asked, who are you leaning to in your vote for president? Almost all of them who began undecided said, we are leaning towards Governor Romney. And when we were probing on what, there was a narrative that had been constructed that many of the challenges and the economic difficulties that me and my family are facing is because of others, immigrants and undocumented, who are denying me or denying people like me opportunity. They took a break after that first part of the discussion, had coffee, grabbed some Skittles, and then sat down and then did 60 minutes on corporations that are shipping jobs overseas. 60 minutes later, the same question, who are you leaning to? Obama. Why? Well, I'm working really hard, but you've got these corporate titans who don't care about me or my family, and they're doing everything to maximize profits. Jonathan, same group of 8 people. The only difference was in their minds at that moment, Who was the villain in the story? That was at the root of what they were experiencing. Turn to, turn on. And what I saw and have seen in electoral politics, unfortunately, the motivation around anger and fear and scarcity, especially in moments like this, is super powerful. And that group of individuals was willing to have one villain above them and one villain in their minds below them. And so the danger in politics is that you will see campaigns that are structured in a way in order to get to 50+1 that are all about finding that vein of anger and turning it. But here's the problem. You can win an election. You can get to 270 or 50+1 in the jurisdiction, but what are you left with?
Right.
That's where the construct around courage versus, the fear is very important, because in a pluralistic democracy, you and I can disagree about 10 things. But the moment that I begin to then question your motives and ascribe characteristics to you as an individual, even if you and I agree on one or two things, I'm not going to work with you, because you are no longer a fellow citizen. You're increasingly becoming an other and an enemy. This is, when I think about all of the existential challenges that we face in the United States and frankly globally, the potency of otherizing and the diminishment of the humanity that we have is at this moment as fraught as anything that I have seen.
So let's talk about this moment. Wait, I just want to make a note. Because this is a moment in which, for many months now, the United States has been in lockdown with an enormous amount of suffering because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've lost over 42 million jobs. So the suffering, and over 100,000 people have died. And then just as it looked like we may begin to open up, the entire nation saw a brutal, senseless, vicious murder, where a policeman murdered George Floyd and was videoed. People begged him to stop, and he didn't stop. And this has set off demonstrations all across the country. The issue of police violence is, and particularly focused on Black American males, is a very, very real issue. Yet there are also policemen who are true public servants and defenders of the peace. So these are the moments when good and evil seem so starkly clear that it is so natural to otherize, even to otherize for the good. So what do you recommend? Has your teaching, the Obama Foundation's methodology changed? What is the message you have for the world now?
So George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. And I remember being in the White House with Trayvon Martin and just countless others. And that is a deep, deep wound that you are now seeing all throughout the country, people expressing the sense of injustice and wrong. And as the president said yesterday, the hopefulness, even in this moment, is to see people taking moments of anguish and turning them into moments of action. That's the place where anguish and anger are important and they cannot be minimized. It is an emotion, it is a feeling, it is real, it doesn't go away. And for too long, just as a human that is dealing with a difficult thought, that you either fight it or fuse with it. Either one of them are bad in terms of outcome. If I fight it, it'll continue to come back even stronger. If I fuse with it and identify with it, it's one of the distinctions that you taught me between empathy and compassion. I can't move to action. So you need to look directly and clearly at it as it exists and assess it. And so what the president talked about yesterday is this is the moment that we are in collectively as a body. Don't turn away from it. Face it. Don't just identify with it. Work in it. And so it's this, the phrase that we have been using is to take the anguish into action. Now, once you do decide to act, as the president talked about yesterday during the town hall meeting, this goes to a style of leadership. Protesting is important. Protesting raises awareness. Protesting is what creates a moment of discomfort for those who hold political and elected power. But it can't just be protest. It also then needs to be about what you do with government and those in elected power and how you channel it. And so here's where otherizing becomes difficult and a challenge. The president talked about building coalitions, about understanding that in order to move forward, you need to call out the injustice in those who did it, but you also need to recognize where there are allies and be open to allyship in a way that is constructive and direct. And so this is the moment, Jonathan, it's that space between that feeling of anguish and anger and recognition, and then what do you do with it? And so I'll give you two examples. One that I think will lead to progress and one that may not. Two young people organize protests. One young person brings together 500 others and they march to the local police precinct. They are moved by what's happened. The list of demands are really not flushed out. The names of the people who attended weren't captured. The follow-up may not occur. The good thing was that awareness was raised. A sense of discomfort was introduced. This is wrong and something needs to be done about it. But where does action now flow strategically from that? It's one protest. Here's another. March to a police precinct. Specific list of demands around things you can do and you want to see around chokeholds in police review boards. The names of the people who participated in the protest are collected. Follow-up action. We will now continue to do X, Y, and Z in service of that. Now, if you are the elected official in those two scenarios, there are two very different reactions. In reaction number one, you may feel terrible about what happened, but there's no directed response that you are being presented with that will require you to say yes or no or something in between. Progress is limited. It may not occur or may occur for other reasons. In the other, clear actions have been requested, and that elected official now has to make a choice, which goes to an organizing principle around power mapping. So if you're going to ask someone in power to do something, you better understand the way they are going to approach what you have asked them to do. What are their incentives? How are they going to think about it outside of the moral and ethical obligation that they have to do right versus wrong? How do they view this electorally? How do they view it from a position of legacy and a variety of other factors? And so a long-winded answer, but I think to the point of the importance in these moments, even when you act, to do it in a way where you are being strategic in building towards something that brings people with you towards a specific outcome. And it's been beautiful to see, Jonathan, and that makes me hopeful.
In fact, so first of all, on the Obama Foundation website, you have a wonderful list of resources. Second of all, there are all kinds of resources about mindful policing and community policing and community policing best practices, etc. And so asking for something very specific, there's another thing, which is a lot of politicians may not know what to do. And
Exactly.
so actually they may want to do the right thing. And so saying, here's the, National Association of Police Chief Officers or whatever, recommendations on community behavior or something like that might turn out to also just be helpful. We're about to go to questions, but just the last thing, which is you said that politicians they do power mapping and they have many different things that they're thinking about. But I have observed that humans have multiple mind frames,
Yes.
and that there are mind frames that we can evoke that raise us to our higher morality, that call on us to be the better angels of ourselves, that actually take us out of the rational decision making and call us to something greater. And these are actually, they can be non-denominational, but they are spiritual in quality. And I go back to your earlier mentioning of interdependence, that they remind us that we are all in this together, and they remind us of an aspiration to act compassionately towards the common good.
Yes. Jonathan, there's a video of, I believe it's the police chief or the sheriff in Flint, Michigan.
Yes. So I want to talk to you about this, and
Yes.
we have some questions coming up, so I'm going to try and talk briefly, and then I think we're going to go a little longer than our slated time, too, because I definitely want to get to the question.
Yes.
So here's what happened. The video is the police chief is standing in front of a crowd, and he says, I'm taking off my helmet and my baton, and we're dropping them. And we are just here with you. We are here to protect you. We want to make sure you have a safe and productive march. And he also says, and by the way, that guy over there, that officer, he just loves to give hugs. So like, he loves hugs. So like, if you want a hug, have a hug. What do you want? And they say, we want you to march with us. And he goes, wow, I'm in. And he joins in, and the police join the people, and they march, and it goes on and on. And it's so wonderful. The police, at the end of the sheriff at the end of the march says, let's do this again tomorrow. And he arranges for there to be bottles of water and a barbecue the next night. Now, there's a backstory to this, which is that Flint, Michigan, one of the most beleaguered African-American majority city, beleaguered cities because it was completely abused by its governor. And we know about the Flint water crisis, in which the 100,000 residents were given water with high lead content, enormous cognitive issues with the children that have come out of this. And Flint has organized, led by something called the Crim Foundation, around something called Mindful Flint. And it turns out that the sheriff was part of the Mindful Flint, but also some of the marchers were part of Mindful Flint. And so in finding that commonality, they had this common language that they could work from together.
This is exactly why I raised it, because in that moment, that leader, in a position of authority, had a choice. And he appealed to something bigger than either a sense of ego, a sense of fear, a sense of recrimination,
Right.
or whatever other type of negative feeling,
Right.
and in a very skillful way, had people transcend. I mean, I
Right.
love that example.
Right.
So thank you for sharing
Right.
the backstory.
But remember, they all, the police, the
Yes.
people, they all transcended.
Yes.
So I'm going to get to some questions. Just one was, could I repeat the three S's and the three C's? So the three S's are separate, selfish, and scared. And the three C's are compassionate, connected, and courageous. And there's a paper that was written on this. And so we will post the paper to our website so that people can find access to it. Abraham asks, how can churches and religious groups harness their immense social capital available amongst their constituents to address systemic social justice maladies in the cities where their members live?
I'm so deeply grateful for that question, Abraham, because, and I forget who said it, but some of the most segregated times in the country are on Sunday mornings. And it's a paradox where actually faith communities and religious communities are so primed and well positioned to break down some of the racist barriers that occur. And so it's not even a question about not being racist, it's about a question now about being anti-racist. And so imagine a world where, whatever the denomination of faith, where there is a deliberate effort by and between faiths that transcends and goes across racial, class, and language boundaries in a way where the clergy has something that very few other people have in their communities, which is almost complete trust. They are modeling and signaling what the appropriate behavior and responses should be. So it is one thing to stand at a pulpit and decry the injustice and the lack of humanity in the murder, in the historical treatment. That is, I argue, a necessary but insufficient. The sufficient piece then is for that clergy member, and this applies to any element of society, to basically then go find the counterpart who is Black or Hispanic or Native American or LGBTQ, and engage in a conversation, not just behind closed doors, obviously it begins there, but then in a way where, imagine that you can now model to an entire faith community within a community that says, okay, not only is this a question of law, but this is a question of spirituality and morality and ethics and faith. That then begins to get to hearts and minds if it is sustained over time and becomes part of that kind of central credo of who we are. And so faith leaders, and you look to the civil rights movement in some of the more powerful images, where the white Catholic priest or the white minister or the rabbi, along with the African American minister leading. And obviously the image of Thich Nhat Hanh and Dr. King, the message that sends, right? It's powerful. So Abraham is on to something very important, and thank you for that question.
So also, as a reference for all of you, check out an organization called Religions for Peace. It's a global organization, brings very high level religious leaders together. And just to give you an example, in Africa, when the AIDS epidemic was spreading and finally its cause became clear, there was a huge amount of misinformation. Taking a shower would eliminate AIDS, or a series of other things. And there was also rumors that said that measles vaccinations gave you AIDS, etc. And so the religious leaders were called together to help solve this. And the and Uganda, the High Mufti imams and the Catholic bishops and all the others all came together and had all of their ministers then preach uh, the gospel of modern medical science, and it significantly helps. So then, Religions for Peace, you'll find a lot of
Yeah.
interesting answers. Another question for you was, can you talk more about the difference between empathy and compassion?
So my formulation, and Jonathan's will be much better, but my formulation is empathy for me is I feel what you are feeling. I am, I see your pain. I feel your pain. I identify with your pain. Um, Compassion is then I want to do something about it. I want to take away your pain. I want to work with you to take away the pain. And so I always think about this continuum of sympathy, I feel bad, to empathy, I, I am identifying and feeling what you're feeling, which can become corrosive, um, especially when you think about first responders and others. And if there's no outlet or channel, compassion isn't then about, at least in my mind, it's creating, even while you feel the pain, it's creating this little space that, without hurting yourself or continue to hurt yourself, allows you to then help remove the pain from others. And then the final piece on the continuum for me is the gold standard of interpersonal relationship. It's trust. That I, at the end of the day, because of either an experience or set of experiences that I've had with you, or my assessment of you, I will rely on you. I believe that you will have my back and I will have yours. I will treat you with integrity and you will reciprocate. That is an earned end state or a state. And so it's what we try to say with leaders at the Obama Foundation, especially when we do story exchange, that beginning of feeling what people are feeling and putting yourselves in their shoes is a necessary precondition to what comes next. And it's the action that
Right.
for me is the distinction between empathy and compassion. So that's
Right.
my formulation.
Right. So it's perfect. I'm going to add just a little bit on the science, which is that empathy not tied to action leads to what's called empathetic distress. And we see this, by the way, hospital emergency room workers and policemen and nurses and people working in humanitarian aid camps, et cetera, and domestic violence shelters, through empathy, actually end up taking on the trauma of something called vicarious trauma of their clients, and it leads to enormous burnout and distress and uh, negative mental states and ill health, actually. Whereas compassion, and we can actually discern, we can train in the difference. I'll get to that in the beginning. Compassion is the feeling for somebody. You're not taking on their feelings, and you're acting and you're doing your best. And even though you see your best is probably not good enough to heal everybody, it's that thing where, people come home from this horrible work and they come home and they feel like it was a meaningful and important day versus they come home and they just feel completely drained. So the outcome, both for the people you're serving, but also the outcome from yourself, is different. This has been scientifically studied, and we'll put on our website a paper by Dr. Tanya Singer, which was published in Science magazine, in which she did MRI studies and actually discerned there are different neurological patterns between empathy and compassion. Susan asks, what are a couple key lessons that you learned during your time working at the Obama administration?
There are so many. First of all, my working with President Obama in learning from his leadership, Never, ever, ever did I see the president or Mrs. Obama treat anyone in a way that wasn't completely respectful, dignified. Many times as president, when you're going to give a speech at a hotel or someplace, you'll go in through the loading dock because you can't go in the front door. And you'll then take the elevator up the freight elevator. And then you will go through the back of the kitchen before you get to the area. And every single time, without fail, the President of the United States would stop, see those men and women, usually people of color, washing the dishes and cleaning the floor, and stop and engage with every single one of them, when literally the next person he was going to talk to was a titan of this and a senator of that. But the difference in the interpersonal connection, there was no variation. So for me, that consistency, when the camera was off, was just a very good lesson then to model for the rest of the team. Don't get all enamored of your title. Oh, I am this and that, and I work in the White House, and I have, that's fine. You serve the American people. Don't forget that. That was lesson, I think, one that as I reflect on that. The other thing that sometimes is hard, but democracy requires work. And too often we view, and I'm guilty of this, so I'm not preaching at people, but too often we view our role as a citizen as simply voting, maybe serving on a jury, maybe writing a letter to the editor, and that is my civic involvement. That is a consumptive view of what it means to be a citizen or a member of a community, especially in a democracy which is based upon our voice. And so there is a fragility to this. And the fragility is exacerbated when we view our place in a democracy as simply being a consumer of it. I have rights, which are critically important, and we should never lose sight of what those hard-earned rights are. But then what are my responsibilities? And it isn't just voting. My responsibilities as a member of a community in Chicago is when 60% of the people who die of COVID are people of color, are African Americans, when they are 2/3 of the population. I have a responsibility. I can't just let that go away. When I do, democracy, this experiment in self-governance becomes more tenuous. And the reason I say that as a lesson, because I have had the great honor and privilege of walking into that building as the son of 2 Portuguese immigrants, day in and day out, and serving the President of the United States. But I have seen the notion, well, the president will take care of it. Mm-hmm. Or the president, it's his fault. Or if he just would do this or just would do that. No. President has a responsibility and a job. But the ceding of responsibility to anyone in elective office is dangerous. It's not the expression of democracy that, and again, I will go back to what was said at the beginning. We are interdependent. And that means that I have a role to play. You have a role to play, because when I act, it affects you. And when you act, it affects me. That's the other lesson that I reflect on a great deal, especially in moments like this. So there are many more, but those are two that immediately come to mind.
So we've come to the end of our time. We have one more amazing question. It's a big question. So
Okay.
I give permission. Anybody, do you have a little more time?
I do.
And
Yes,
and
please.
anybody who had to leave, thank you for being with us. We understand. We'll make this the last question. Um, Einstein is attributed with saying, given 1 hour to save the planet, I
Mm.
would spend 59 minutes understanding the problem and 1 minute resolving it. What is the process one might follow in order that understanding be revealed? There's a world of difference between seeing that there's a problem and knowing how to fix it, between getting others to see the truth. Um, so, and that ultimately, how do you engage people in a dialogue? So, how do
Yeah.
you, how do we move from seeing the problem to acting on the problem, and how do we engage in dialogue with people who
So,
have an alternate view?
yeah. First of all, it requires each one of us in our individual capacity as citizens, as agents, as a member of a community, that the next time that you feel triggered about something, rather than condemn or indict, engage. And don't engage with a presupposition about, how do I say this in the best way? You may feel you're right, but leave open the possibility that you're not. And you may feel that the other person is venal and completely wrong, but leave open the possibility that they're just seeing the world from a little bit of a different perspective that you have no conception of. I firmly believe, Jonathan, and how do you scale in a country of 330 million people that individual act of courage? It ripples. President Obama, when he was running for president in 2007, would end many of his speeches with a story where he would conjure an image of a young man or woman in a room who, notwithstanding the views of everyone else in the room that they were wrong,
Hmm.
had that courage to stand up and not say, you're all wrong, but to say, I hear you, but I view things a little bit differently. And then it's that idea that one voice can change a room, and then that room can change a neighborhood, and that neighborhood can change a city, and that city can change a state, change a country, but it begins with an individual act of courage. Now, that is the broad application. The one thing I would love to see, and I know so many people are working on this, is a notion of civics education that isn't about the raw memorization of the three branches or this happened and then that happened. But imagine a world where in kindergarten and in grammar school and in middle school, you are teaching students how to engage in dialogue across difference, because that's the heart of democracy. You and I are very different people. I believe this, you believe that. Can we transcend that? Can we bridge to make something better? Sometimes I win and sometimes you will win, lose, right? Even the language is fraught. But that, from a very kind of tactical perspective, is one thing. And some states are beginning to reimagine civics education along those lines. And so I am forever hopeful.
Well, thank you. So we're going to end on hope. Um, David, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. And audience, thank you so much for joining us. Our next session is going to be on June 11th at 2 o'clock with Gerald Torres. Gerald is a professor at Yale University in the School of Forestry and Environment and a leading thinker and doer on the issue of civil rights and environmental justice. Please keep checking the garrisoninstitute.org website for updated listings of future sessions and to view recording of this webinar and others. And again, we provide these sessions free of charge. And if you'd like to support this effort, please consider making a donation to the garrisoninstitute.org. And this isn't in the script, but I want to add, you've been doing an amazing job of that. We are so heartened by the donations that come in. This is a difficult time for many, many. It's a difficult time for the Institute too, because we're closed. But what we've discovered is that we're open to a much bigger world because of you, and we're very grateful for that. Thank you. May everybody be happy and healthy and safe. And thanks again, David.
Thank you, Jonathan. Be well.